In this video, we will look at the executions carried out in the United States in March 2026. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. On March 3, 2026, after spending more than 35 years on Florida's death row, Billy Leon Kearse was executed by lethal injection. 35 years ago, he gave an officer a name, but that didn't exist, so he gave him another. But that one was fake too. Then a third, all made up. They only bought him a few more seconds before the handcuffs came out. Back then, Billy was 18 years old and pulled over for driving the wrong way down a one-way street in Fort Pierce, Florida. A minor traffic violation, the kind of stop that ends with a ticket and a wave goodbye. But Billy was on probation for burglary, and he knew that if this officer ran his real name, he was going back to prison. So when Sergeant Danny Parrish told him to step out of the car, Billy made a choice that would end one life on the pavement that night and put another on death row for the next 35 years. On the night of January 18, 1991, 29-year-old Sergeant Danny Thomas Parrish was on patrol when he spotted a vehicle heading the wrong way down a one-way street. He pulled the car over and approached the driver's side window. Behind the wheel was Billy Leon Kearse, 18 years old, with no driver's license and a probation term hanging over his head. Earlier that evening, Billy had picked up a Domino's pizza with a 21-year-old woman named Rhonda Pendleton. She later told police she only knew him as Baldy. They were heading to her brother's house because Billy's stepfather had hit him during a fight earlier that day. Billy was driving a blue Monte Carlo with a broken headlight. He turned onto Orange Avenue, then right on North 7th Street, then right on Avenue A, driving the wrong way on the one-way street. That's when Sergeant Parrish spotted him. When Danny asked for identification, Billy started cycling through fake names, one after another, none of them matching any records. For the next 18 minutes, Danny patiently radioed dispatch, asking them to search different spellings and variations of the names Billy gave him. But none of them came back. At 8:05 p.m., Danny signed off with the dispatcher. He had written 2 citations for the traffic violations and told Billy he was under arrest for driving without a license. Billy placed his hands on the roof of the car, but as soon as Danny approached with the handcuffs, Billy panicked. He was on probation for car burglary, and he knew what an arrest meant. A physical struggle broke out on the side of the road. According to court records, Danny struck Billy in the eye during the scuffle, and that's when everything spiraled. Danny was reaching for his holster when Billy spun around, grabbed the gun, and pushed him back. With both hands locked tight on the 9mm Sig Sauer at waist level, Billy pulled the trigger. Witnesses heard 1 shot, then 2 more, then a barrage. An eyewitness watched Danny crawling across the street until Billy stood over him and fired 6 more rounds. "Come on, man, don't do it, don't do it," were Danny's last words, according to Billy's own statement to detectives. But Billy kept firing. Some bullets went up under Danny's vest because he was still pulling the trigger after Danny was already down. In total, Billy fired 13 of the 16 rounds in the magazine. 9 struck Danny's body. 4 hit his bulletproof vest. And 2 unfired rounds were still in Billy's pocket when police found him. He had nearly emptied the entire weapon into a man who was begging him to stop. A nearby taxi driver heard the gunshots and saw Billy speed away in the Monte Carlo. He ran to Danny, who was still moving slightly, his eyes open but vacant. He called for help on Danny's radio, saying twice that the officer was already dead. 3 minutes. That's all it took between Danny signing off with dispatch and a stranger calling in his death. Billy drove back to the house, pulled the car around back to hide it, sat down on the couch, and smoked a cigarette. Then he buried Danny's gun in the backyard. Meanwhile, investigators traced the Monte Carlo's registration, and within hours, Billy Leon Kearse was arrested. During questioning, he sent detectives on a wild goose chase to the C-25 canal, claiming he had thrown the weapon there. They eventually found it buried in the backyard. When they asked why he did it, Billy said, "It was him or me." Sergeant Danny Parrish was pronounced dead at the hospital. He was 29 years old. His widow, Mirtha, would later describe him as an all-around, down-to-earth guy. He liked to hunt and fish, and he loved his job. Danny was expecting a promotion to detective. According to her, he had already bought a closet full of new shirts, pants, and ties for the role. When he was killed, the store tags were still on them. But Danny hadn't always been a police officer. After high school, Danny served 4 years as an Army mechanic. When he came home, the city of Fort Pierce hired him to work on police cars. But in 1987, 2 of his friends on the force, Jimmy Wouters and Captain Grover Cooper, were killed in a drug raid turned shootout. And that changed everything. Danny decided to become a cop himself. His mother, Faye, would later say the family didn't want him to become a policeman. But Danny told them he wanted to join the narcotics department and help keep kids off drugs. 2 years after joining full-time, he was dead. On January 22nd, 1,500 mourners gathered for Danny's funeral. The honor guard fired a 21-gun salute. A bagpiper played Amazing Grace. And then the voice of dispatch signed off Officer 541 for the last time. But the question everyone was asking was simple. How does a routine traffic stop turn into a police officer being shot 13 times? Billy Leon Kearse was born on October 26, 1972, into a childhood defined by neglect and chaos. His mother was a teenager when she had him, and his father abandoned the family when Billy was 2. Teachers, counselors, and psychologists who knew him all described the same thing. A boy who was hungry, poorly clothed, dirty, and constantly running away from home. When authorities asked him why he kept running, Billy told them he felt safer in juvenile detention than he did in his own house. And that was just the start. Testimony would later reveal his mother drank heavily during her pregnancy with Billy, and as a toddler, he suffered a head injury. By school age, he was placed in special education programs for severely disturbed children. He dropped out after completing the 8th grade, but testing later revealed he was functioning academically at a 3rd grade level. Billy's first encounter with police came when he was just 8 years old. He was labeled beyond control, and that same year he was arrested for petty theft. By 10, his record included more theft charges and a burglary arrest. As a juvenile, he accumulated numerous arrests, mostly nonviolent property offenses: burglary, theft, criminal mischief, trespassing, auto theft. In February 1990, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by probation, and he had only recently been released when he encountered Sergeant Parrish on that one-way street. But what happened at trial would turn this case into something far more complicated than a panicked teenager with a stolen gun. Just 2 days after the shooting, Billy was charged with first-degree murder and robbery with a firearm. The robbery charge came from taking the officer's gun during the struggle, and it gave prosecutors a second aggravating factor on top of the murder of a law enforcement officer. 2 separate legal reasons to argue for death. Billy's trial began in early October 1991 in Vero Beach, and from day one, something unusual filled the courtroom. Uniformed law enforcement officers from across the state packed the gallery every single day of the trial. Rows of badges and uniforms, a visible wall of support for the fallen officer, and an unmistakable message to the jury about who was watching. On October 22nd, the jury found Billy guilty of first-degree murder and robbery with a firearm. During the sentencing phase, his defense team tried to present a sympathetic picture of Billy's life. Witnesses testified about his neglected childhood. Psychological testing suggested possible brain damage and low intellectual functioning, all linked to his mother's drinking during pregnancy. But that didn't matter much. On October 24th, the jury voted 11-1 to recommend death. Danny's 25-year-old widow, Mirtha, said Billy deserved to die for murdering her husband. Danny's sister and mother both condemned Billy and supported the sentence. On November 8, 1991, Circuit Judge Mark Chianca formally sentenced Billy Leon Kearse to death by electric chair. Billy was 19 years old, but his case was far from over. 2 years later, Billy's attorneys appealed to the Florida Supreme Court, arguing that improper jury instructions had tainted the original sentencing. In 1995, the court agreed and threw out his death sentence. But prosecutors immediately announced they would seek death again. At the resentencing in December 1996, Billy's defense team came back with a much deeper case. They brought in 4 mental health experts, and every single one of them reached the same conclusion. Billy suffered from brain damage caused by fetal alcohol exposure and a childhood head injury. He functioned at a 3rd grade level. He had acted impulsively the night he killed Sergeant Parrish, not out of calculation, but because his damaged brain couldn't process the consequences. One expert explained that the memory gaps Billy described weren't lies. He was confabulating, filling in what he believed was reasonable because he genuinely couldn't remember what happened. But the prosecution had their own expert, and he disagreed with all of it. Dr. Daniel Martel took the stand and dismantled the defense's case. He testified that Billy didn't have brain damage. He said the test results showed Billy was deliberately faking symptoms to avoid responsibility. His diagnosis was antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, not emotional disturbance. Dr. Martel concluded that Billy understood exactly what he was doing when he killed Sergeant Parrish, that he made a conscious decision with each squeeze of the trigger, and that afterward he took deliberate steps to conceal his involvement by taking the gun and hiding it. 4 experts said Billy's brain was damaged and he acted on impulse. One expert said he was faking it all and knew exactly what he was doing. The jury had to decide who to believe. Do you think Billy Kearse was a damaged teenager who snapped in a moment of panic? Or a cold, calculating killer who made a choice 13 times in a row? Drop your answer in the comments. On December 19, 1996, the jury voted unanimously to reimpose the death penalty, and on March 24, 1997, Billy was resentenced to death. Over the next 3 decades, Billy filed appeal after appeal. But all of them were rejected. Court after court reviewed the case, and court after court denied relief. And while Billy filed appeal after appeal, the people Danny left behind were running out of time. His mother, who had stood in that courtroom and demanded the death penalty for her son's killer, died without ever seeing it carried out. So did his father. His best friend on the force, Charlie Scavuzzo, died of a heart attack. Officer Tim Gunn, the man who dropped to his knees on that pavement and performed CPR trying to save Danny's life, took his own. And Danny's sergeant that night, Les Lazenby, died after complications from an on-duty ambush. One by one, the people who loved Danny Parrish were gone, and Billy Leon Kearse was still alive. Meanwhile, inside a cell the size of a bathroom, Billy changed. Or so they said. He taught himself to paint, creating intricate artwork with whatever limited materials he could get. He sent paintings to friends and family. And he spoke openly about remorse for what happened that night in Fort Pierce. The 18-year-old who shot Sergeant Parrish on the side of the road was now a 53-year-old man who had spent more than half his life on death row. Then, on January 29, 2026, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Billy's death warrant. When the warrant was announced, Mirtha, who had spent 35 years writing letters and lobbying to make this happen, spoke publicly. She said it was bittersweet, that to wish anybody harm or death would be not human of her, that it wasn't right. But that getting final closure for the heinous act Billy committed was very much needed and very much overdue. Billy's execution by lethal injection was scheduled for March 3, 2026. When Billy was first sentenced in 1991, his death was supposed to come by electric chair. But after a series of botched electrocutions in Florida during the 1990s, the state quietly switched its default method to lethal injection in 2000. Billy had been on death row so long that even the way the state planned to kill him had changed. On March 3rd, Billy's final day came. That morning, he woke up at 6:30 a.m. He declined a final meal. He spent part of the day with a spiritual advisor, but received no other visitors. No family, no friends, just a man alone in his cell, waiting for the hours to pass. Throughout the day, officials described him as calm and compliant. Late in the afternoon, Billy was transferred to the execution chamber. At 6 p.m., the curtain to the witness room opened. Billy was already strapped to the gurney, with IV lines placed in both arms. When asked if he had any final words, Billy spoke. He looked at those witnessing his execution and said, "To his family, I sincerely apologize for what I've done. There is no way I can ever repay that with this death. It will never repay that. And in turn, I pray that my Father would give me strength to ask their forgiveness so I can go on my journey. All I can do is ask for their forgiveness to give you peace and resolve. Thank you." Then the injection began. He took a few slow breaths as the drugs took effect. Within minutes, his breathing gradually slowed and then ceased. After the required medical checks were completed and no response was observed, he was pronounced dead at 6:24 p.m. Billy Leon Kearse was 53 years old. The next week, Texas executed their second inmate of 2026. But what did this man do to end up on death row? On March 11, 2026, after more than 12 years on death row, Cedric Allen Ricks was executed by lethal injection for the murders of his girlfriend and her 8-year-old son. But what most people don't know is that the day before the killings, Cedric had been in a Tarrant County courtroom facing assault charges for strangling that same girlfriend 6 months earlier. He knew the charges were going to stick this time. He knew the relationship was over. And 24 hours later, Roxanne Sanchez and her son Anthony were dead on the living room floor, stabbed repeatedly while her 2 other children watched. One of those children, 12-year-old Marcus, survived 25 stab wounds by imitating the sound of his little brother dying. This is what happened. Shortly after 7 p.m. on May 1st, 2013, 30-year-old Roxanne Sanchez and her 3 sons arrived home from the grocery store at the Colonial Village Apartments in Bedford, Texas. She carried her 9-month-old baby Isaiah and some of the bags upstairs to their 3rd-floor apartment, while her 2 older boys, 12-year-old Marcus and 8-year-old Anthony, went to their bedroom to play. Roxanne started cooking dinner. Living with them was Roxanne's boyfriend, 38-year-old Cedric Ricks, who was also Isaiah's father, while Marcus and Anthony were Roxanne's children from a previous relationship. Between 7:10 and 7:20 that evening, a neighbor walking through the stairwell heard Cedric screaming, "Don't have me come down here and waste my mother time on this bull." But when the neighbor passed the couple on the stairs, Cedric went quiet. Roxanne was carrying 2 bags of groceries and looked distraught. While the boys remained in their bedroom, Cedric and Roxanne continued their argument in the apartment, and soon the yelling escalated into screaming. When Marcus and Anthony ran to the living room to see what was happening, they found Cedric and Roxanne hitting each other. Then, Cedric pushed Roxanne to the floor. The boys tried to get between them to break up the fight, but Cedric shoved Marcus down and kept punching Roxanne. Then he walked to the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a knife. And what started as a fist fight was about to become something much worse. Cedric began stabbing Roxanne repeatedly as she tried to protect herself, but it wasn't enough. Marcus ran to his bedroom closet and tried to call police, but Cedric followed him and ripped the closet door open. Marcus dropped the phone, and in an effort to protect himself, he grabbed the blade of the knife to try to stop Cedric, but it sliced deep into his hand. Cedric chased Marcus back into the living room. Anthony was standing next to the couch with blood on his face, begging Marcus to get help. But before either boy could escape, Cedric pushed Marcus face down on the ground, held his head with one hand, and stabbed him repeatedly in the back of the neck. Then, Cedric shoved Anthony to the floor next to his brother. And while Marcus watched, unable to move, Cedric stabbed Anthony over and over until he made a gurgling noise and went still. When Marcus tried to get up, Cedric pinned him down and started stabbing him again. Marcus knew he had to do something. So he copied the gurgling noise Anthony had just made, the sound of his brother's final breaths. And it worked. Cedric stopped. Cedric walked to the kitchen, placed the knife in the sink, and washed his hands. Then he walked to the master bedroom and took a shower. After drying off, he made a phone call, packed his clothes, placed baby Isaiah in his crib, and left the apartment. He took Roxanne's car and simply drove away. Marcus stayed on the floor, bleeding badly from dozens of wounds, too terrified to move in case Cedric came back. So he lay there next to the bodies of his mother and his brother until he was sure Cedric was gone. Then he looked out the window, saw that the car was missing, and called 911. "My mom's boyfriend killed my mom and my other brother," he told the operator. "He stabbed them. He took my mom's car and left." Officer Clayton Baxley arrived first and could hear a baby screaming inside. When backup arrived and the officers opened the door, Marcus came through it covered in blood from head to toe. The back of his head, neck, and shoulders were so badly lacerated that he was bleeding through his clothes. He was in shock and couldn't sit down. Inside the apartment, officers found Roxanne and Anthony lying on the floor surrounded by massive amounts of blood. They found baby Isaiah crying in a crib in the back bedroom, and he appeared unharmed. Marcus was airlifted to Cook Children's Medical Center. He had lost over 40% of his blood. Doctors found 3 separate stab wounds to his head, one of which had penetrated bone, and he had 9 wounds to the back of his neck. He underwent a 6-hour surgery to close his wounds, followed by a second surgery that lasted another 2 hours. Without immediate medical intervention, Marcus would have died. But he survived and would later testify against the man who tried to kill him. Roxanne Sanchez and Anthony Figueroa were pronounced dead at the scene, and autopsies would later reveal the extent of the brutality. Roxanne had suffered an instantly fatal stab wound that severed her spinal column at the brainstem, and a second stab wound cut through her right carotid artery. She also had defensive wounds on her hands, evidence of blunt force trauma to her head, and signs of manual strangulation. Anthony had been stabbed over 40 times. One wound penetrated his skull into his brain, and another cut through his jugular vein and pierced his larynx. Roxanne had worked as a medical assistant and was known by everyone around her as a devoted mother. Her brother Chris told reporters, no matter how hard of a time Roxanne was going through, she always had a smile and helped somebody else. He said the boys were always laughing and smiling, and he called them Mama's boys because of how close they were to their mother. Roxanne's best friend of 18 years, Amanda Gomez, said, "She loved her children more than anything and would do anything for them. You can look into their eyes and see her." That was the woman Cedric left dead on the living room floor. And while her family was about to get the worst phone call of their lives, Cedric was already making one of his own. After leaving the apartment, Cedric called his cousin Tamara Butts in Mansfield, Texas. "I did something bad," he told her, and when he spoke to Tamara's father, he was more direct. "I messed up," he said. "I killed Roxanne and the boys." He asked them to go get Isaiah from the apartment, and when Tamara urged him to turn himself in, Cedric told her he would die before he ever went to jail. But Tamara immediately called 911 and gave police Cedric's phone number. She kept texting him to help officers track his location. And using a cell phone ping through Sprint, Detective Joey Gager determined Cedric was heading north on Interstate 35 through Oklahoma. Around 10:30 p.m., Oklahoma State Troopers spotted Roxanne's silver Nissan Altima at a gas station off I-35 near Ardmore. They confirmed the plate number with Bedford police and pulled Cedric over. He stopped immediately and didn't resist. He was taken into custody and transported to the Garvin County Detention Center. A jailer warned him not to tell anyone why he was there, but Cedric told his cellmates anyway, and they beat him for it. At midnight, a judge in Texas signed arrest warrants for the murders of Roxanne and Anthony and the attempted murder of Marcus. But there's something about this case that makes the events of May 1st even harder to process, because what happened that night didn't come out of nowhere. It was the end of a pattern that stretched back years and across multiple women. Cedric had been arrested for domestic violence 5 or 6 times before this. He couldn't even remember exactly how many. He had also been arrested multiple times for violating protective orders and 5 times for resisting arrest. His ex-wife, Tashana Singleton, testified at trial that Cedric once choked her unconscious outside a police station, and when she gave birth to his son, Cedric looked at the baby and said, "I hope it dies." Then came Roxanne. 6 months before the murders in November 2012, Roxanne showed up at the emergency room at Texas Health Harris Methodist in Bedford. The triage nurse asked her what brought her in. Roxanne told her she had been strangled until she lost consciousness and that her head had been pounded against the floor. She rated her pain a 10 out of 10. The nurse categorized her as a priority trauma patient. An emergency protective order was issued, and Cedric was barred from going near Roxanne, the boys, their school, her workplace, and her mother's house. But that protective order expired in January 2013, and Roxanne eventually went back to him. And remember that Cedric had been in court the day before the murders? Here's why that matters. On April 30th, 2013, Cedric appeared before a judge on the pending assault charges from that November strangulation. And he later admitted that he knew he wasn't going to get out of those charges like he had before. He and Roxanne were also in the process of splitting up. So the argument over groceries on May 1st wasn't a random explosion. It was the final act of a man who knew the relationship was ending, the legal system was closing in, and this time there would be consequences. At trial in May 2014, Marcus Figueroa took the stand and described what happened that night. He told the jury how Cedric held his head down with one hand and stabbed him with the other, how he didn't say a word while he did it, and how Marcus copied the dying sounds of his younger brother to make Cedric think he was dead. The jury needed only 45 minutes to convict Cedric of capital murder, and during the sentencing phase, the defense presented something that had never been used in a Texas criminal case before. During sentencing, they brought in a neuroscience researcher who testified that Cedric's brain was literally built for aggression. Every brain scan they used showed he went into sensory overload during arguments and couldn't control his impulses. His mother, Helen Ricks, also testified. "We tried everything we could to help him," she said. "We tried whipping him, we went to counselors, we did what we could. We never thought we would be in a position like this." But then Cedric himself took the stand. He claimed he was acting in self-defense, that the whole house had ganged up on him and he feared for his life. A 38-year-old man with a history of domestic violence, claiming self-defense against a woman and her 2 children. Then, instead of fighting for his life, he told the jury he wanted to die. "It's irrelevant what happened that night," he said. "The jury made a decision to convict me on the facts that were presented." After roughly 7 hours, the jury recommended the death penalty. And on May 29, 2014, Cedric Allen Ricks was formally sentenced to death. For the next 12 years, Cedric sat on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky Unit, the facility that houses all of Texas's male death row inmates. During that time, Cedric underwent what many described as a spiritual transformation. He became a devout Christian and began writing letters to supporters around the world. And in one letter to a supporter in Italy, he wrote about watching the Olympics and being moved by the opening ceremony. He signed off with, "I love you. Keep me in your deepest prayers. Solidarity in Christ and friendship. With affection, Cedric." But the courts weren't moved. Cedric had confessed to the crimes and exhausted his appeals relatively quickly. On November 4, 2024, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected his final appeal, in which he had asked for his death sentence to be commuted to life in prison. Advocacy groups launched clemency campaigns. The community of Sant'Egidio argued that Cedric's transformation was genuine and that his life should be spared. Petitions circulated, vigils were planned outside the Huntsville unit, but Texas had no intention of stopping the execution. And for Marcus Figueroa, now in his mid-20s, there was no redemption. He had watched his mother and brother die. He had been stabbed 25 times and forced to pretend to be dead to survive. The trauma of that night would follow him forever. In October 2025, during National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, the Tarrant County District Attorney's Office announced the execution date. On March 11th, Cedric's final day came. Texas doesn't allow a special last meal, so Cedric ate whatever the rest of the prison was eating that day. Cedric arrived at the Huntsville unit around midday. Prison officials said he was quiet. He turned down the chance to speak with his attorney. The one thing he did ask for was a necklace with a cross on it, the same one he had worn on death row. He put it on. Prison records list Cedric as Jewish, but he declined to have a spiritual advisor present. Inside the chamber, Cedric was strapped to a gurney. IV lines were inserted into both arms. On the other side of a glass window, 7 of his victims' relatives watched. And standing just steps from the gurney, looking through the glass, was Marcus Figueroa. On the back of his neck, visible above his shirt collar and below his hair, were several scars from that night. He showed no emotion. When the warden asked Cedric if he had a final statement, he spoke. "I want to say that I'm sorry for taking Roxanne and Anthony from y'all," he said. "I'm glad to be able to speak to tell y'all that face to face." He said he hoped that one day his victims' relatives would find it in their hearts to forgive him. Then he turned his words to Marcus. "I always thought about you, and I'm sorry that I took your mom and your brother away. I hate that you had to experience that. I just can't imagine, but I'm truly sorry for what I've done, and I wish y'all peace and joy as much as you can, but I'm sorry. That's all I can say." His voice cracked. A tear formed in his eye. He said he hoped to find Roxanne and Anthony in heaven and tell them he was sorry face to face. "I hope y'all go in peace. I really do. I'm sorry," he concluded. Then the lethal dose of pentobarbital began to flow. Cedric took 19 quick breaths. Then he made 10 snoring sounds. Seconds later, a few intermittent gurgles. And then all movement and all sound stopped. He was pronounced dead at 6:55 p.m. Cedric Allen Ricks was 51 years old. Here's something that surprises us every time we check our analytics. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now are not subscribed. 90%. This story is exactly the kind of story that needs to reach further. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Now, let's continue. On March 17, 2026, after spending more than 16 years on death row, Michael Lee King was executed in Florida for the kidnapping and murder of 21-year-old Denise Amber Lee. 5 911 calls were made on January 17, 2008. Her husband called when he found their 2 babies alone in a crib and Denise missing. Michael's own cousin called after hearing a woman scream from the back seat. The cousin's daughter called right after and gave police Michael's name and address. Denise herself called from her kidnapper's phone, begging the dispatcher for help. And a stranger at a traffic light called after watching a hand bang against the car window while someone screamed inside. 5 calls, 5 chances to save her, and not a single one brought help in time. But what makes this case unlike almost any other is what Denise did while no one was coming to help her. To understand that, we need to go back to the morning of January 17, 2008. On that Thursday morning, 36-year-old Michael Lee King drove to a local firing range in Northport, Florida, with a friend named Robert Salvador. They signed in just before noon. Michael pulled a 9mm handgun from under the passenger seat of his dark green 1994 Chevrolet Camaro, and the 2 men spent about an hour shooting. Michael didn't bring any ammunition, so Robert let him use his. When they left, Robert believed Michael's gun was empty, but there were moments when he wasn't watching, moments when Michael could have taken extra rounds. That same afternoon, between 1 and 2 p.m., a neighbor of Nathan and Denise Lee was watching television from a spot that gave her a clear view of the street. She noticed a green Camaro with a black car bra creeping up and down the road. The car circled the block 4 or 5 times. And when she walked outside to check, the Camaro pulled into the Lee's driveway. The neighbor made eye contact with the driver, assumed he had found who he was looking for, and went back inside. 10 to 15 minutes later, The Camaro was gone, and so was Denise. At around 3:30 p.m., Nathan Lee came home to check on his family. The doors were locked, so he used his key to get in. The windows Denise said she had opened that morning were now closed, but her keys, purse, and cell phone were all still in the house. Both boys were together in one crib, which felt kind of weird. And on top of it all, Denise was gone. Nathan called 911 immediately.
Northport Emergency?
Yes, I'm at 7912 Latour Avenue. I just got home from work, and my wife, I can't find her. My kids were in the house, and I don't know where she is. I've looked every single place.
Everything looked normal. It's just the only thing that wasn't normal was the fact that obviously Denise wasn't there.
Detective Chris Morales of the Northport Police Department responded to the home on Latour Avenue. But there were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. The children were unharmed, so there was not much to go off on, only that Denise had vanished. Denise Amber Lee was 21 years old. She and Nathan had met at Lemon Bay High School in Englewood. She was the shy and the studious one, while he was the popular athlete. She asked him out on their first date, and they had been inseparable ever since. For their first Valentine's Day, Nathan gave her a $40 heart-shaped ring. Denise wore it every single day and never took it off. They married in August 2005 and settled in Northport. And by January 2008, they had 2 sons, Noah, who was 2, and Adam, who was 6 months old. Denise's father, Rick Goff, was a sergeant with the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office. Nathan worked 3 jobs to support their family. That morning, he had called Denise at around 11 a.m. during his lunch break. They talked about the weather. Denise said she had opened the windows to let some fresh air in. It was a normal conversation, but it was the last one they would ever have. What Nathan didn't know yet was that just hours later, Michael took Denise to his own home in Northport. Inside the master bedroom, prosecutors later described what they found as a rape room. Mirrors had been taken off the dining room wall and hung against the bedroom wall. Duct tape, pillows, and blankets were on the floor. Michael had bound Denise's wrists with duct tape and sexually assaulted her. DNA evidence later confirmed that bodily fluids found on a Winnie the Pooh blanket in the room matched Michael's profile. After assaulting her, Michael forced Denise into the back seat of his Camaro. He covered her with a blanket and drove to his cousin, Harold Muxlow's house, arriving between 5:30 and 6 p.m. Michael told Harold he needed a flashlight, a gas can, and a shovel. "My lawnmower is stuck in my front yard," he said. Harold handed over the tools, but as he walked back toward his house, Harold heard a female voice scream from the vehicle, "Call the cops!" Harold turned around and walked back to the car and asked Michael what was going on. Michael lifted his head from beside the passenger side and said, "Nothing, don't worry about it." But Harold wasn't buying it. He walked closer and saw Michael crawling over the center console, pushing the head of someone with shoulder-length hair down into the back seat. He also saw part of a knee rise up. Then, Michael climbed into the driver's seat and drove off. Harold went back inside and told his 17-year-old daughter Sabrina what he had just seen. And Sabrina didn't hesitate. She called 911.
I just got a call from my dad, and his cousin came over his house with a girl in the car. He borrowed a shovel, a gas tank, and something else.
What's the cousin driving?
A green Camaro.
What's the cousin's name?
Mikey King.
But Harold still wasn't sure what to believe. So he drove to Michael's house to check whether a lawnmower was actually stuck in the yard. There was no lawnmower and no Camaro. So he placed his own anonymous 911 call describing the vehicle and warning that someone might be held against her will inside. And then, at 6:14 p.m., Denise made her move. While trapped in the back seat, she managed to get hold of Michael's cell phone and dialed 911 herself. And what followed was one of the most heartbreaking recordings in American criminal history. For several minutes, Denise spoke to the dispatcher while pretending to talk to her captor. She could be heard crying and begging for her life. I'm sorry, I just want to go." The dispatcher said hello, but Denise couldn't hear her. She just kept talking. "I'm sorry, I just want to see my family." The dispatcher kept saying hello over and over, but Denise just continued. "My name is Denise. I'm married to a beautiful husband, and I just want to see my kids again." At some point, Michael's voice could also be heard on the recording. "Why did you do that?" he said, talking about Denise's cry for help at his cousin's house. "I'm sorry," Denise said. "I just want to see my family again. Please, let me go." Then Michael's tone shifted. "I was going to let you go, and then you go around." He was looking for his phone now, the one Denise was using to call 911. Then Denise asked the question every person listening to this recording remembers. "Are you going to hurt me?" Michael said, "Give me the phone." Denise answered, "Are you going to let me out now?" Michael said, "As soon as I get the phone." Then Denise said one final word to the dispatcher, "Help me," and then the line went dead. But the calls didn't stop there. Around the same time, a man named Sean Johnson was stopped at a traffic light when he heard screaming coming from a green Camaro. He would later identify Michael from a photo lineup. Then, at approximately 6:30 p.m., Jane Kowalski pulled up at a traffic light on Highway 41 and heard something she would never forget. Screaming from the Camaro in the lane beside her. She made eye contact with the driver, and she later described the sound as horrific, terrified. "I've never ever heard anything like that in my life." She watched the driver turn and push something down in the back seat. Then a hand rose up from behind and started banging on the passenger side window. When the light turned green, Jane hesitated, hoping to get behind the car so she could read the license plate. But Michael refused to drive forward. When Jane began to slowly roll forward, he changed lanes and pulled behind her. And when she realized he wouldn't pass, she dialed 911 and described everything she was seeing.
They kept banging on the window and screaming, and not a happy scream like, "Get me out of here" scream.
Then she watched the Camaro turn onto Toledo Blade Boulevard, heading toward Interstate 75. Jane's call should have been the brake police needed. She gave a detailed description of the car, the driver, and the direction he was heading. But there was a catastrophic problem. Jane had crossed the county line into Charlotte County when she dialed 911, so her call was routed to the Charlotte County Dispatch Center, not the Sarasota County Center coordinating the search for Denise just blocks away. The call was never forwarded to the proper authorities, and help never came. Nathan Lee later put it simply, she would still be here if the 911 system didn't fail. All they had to do was just say one sentence over the radio, and it would have been a totally different outcome. At 9 p.m. that evening, Deputy Christian Weimer and State Trooper Edward Pope were watching for a green Camaro near Interstate 75. They had a description, a plate number, and photos of both Denise and Michael. Then, at approximately 9:10 p.m., a green Camaro matching the description drove onto the I-75 southbound on-ramp. Trooper Edward initiated a felony stop. He drew his weapon and ordered the driver out. It took 5 commands, but when the door finally opened, Michael Lee King stepped out backward, leaning over the console toward the passenger seat. He was wet from the waist down. His shoes were caked with mud. He had changed from the white shirt Harold saw earlier into a camouflage pattern. And in his pockets, they found his wallet, his ID, and a cell phone with the battery and SIM card removed. On the front of the Camaro, Edward found strands of hair and what appeared to be blood. A thick, sap-like substance coated the car bra. And inside the vehicle, he found a gas can, a cell phone battery, a blanket, and a ring in the back seat. A heart-shaped ring. The one Nathan had given Denise on their first Valentine's Day. The one she never took off. But Denise was not in the car. After the Camaro was towed to the police station, investigators went through it piece by piece, and what they found told a story. A shovel with dirt caked on the underside was in the back seat, the same shovel Harold had lent to Michael hours earlier. A palm print on the driver's side window matched Denise. Hair strands found on the outside of the car matched her DNA. Blood on the blanket in the back seat did too. And the sap-like substance on the car bra The thick residue Trooper Edward had noticed during the stop would later be identified as something far worse. But the car wasn't the only place Denise left her mark. When investigators searched Michael's home, they found duct tape in the garbage with strands of hair attached. The hair matched Denise. Bodily fluids found on a Winnie the Pooh blanket in the room matched Michael's profile. And blood on that same blanket matched Denise. Everything prosecutors would later describe about the room had been there all along. Michael hadn't cleaned up a thing, and Denise had made sure there was plenty to find. But none of it told them where she was. On January 18th, during the search for Denise, someone noticed an area of disturbed earth near Plantation Boulevard in Northport. 2 small piles of sand looked out of place, and it appeared blood had been on the ground before the sand was placed over it. On the morning of January 19th, a forensics team began digging. The scallop marks in the soil matched the round-nosed shovel Harold had lent to Michael, and at a depth of 3 feet 1 inch, they found Denise, naked, lying on her side in a fetal position, with a single gunshot wound to the head. A 9mm shell casing was found in the grass nearby, which matched 3 of the 47 casings collected from the firing range where Michael had been shooting just hours before abducting Denise. The medical examiner determined the gun had been placed against the right side of Denise's head just above her eyebrow when it was fired. The shot destroyed her right eye on impact. The sap-like substance found on the carburetor was likely her ocular fluid. There was aspirated blood in her lungs, meaning Denise continued to breathe for some time after the shot. She also had vaginal bruising and tearing consistent with sexual assault. Semen recovered from her body matched Michael's DNA. For the prosecution, it was clear. Michael was their guy. But during questioning, Michael tried to claim he was a victim too. "I got hijacked," he told detectives. "I tried to put 911 on the phone and everything." But the police didn't believe a word of it. There was one thing, however, no one could explain. Michael had no connection to Denise. He had never met her. The Lee family had never heard his name, and to this day, no one knows why he chose her. Michael went to trial in August 2009. There, he pleaded not guilty. But the evidence was overwhelming. On August 28th, after just over 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Michael Lee King guilty of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and kidnapping. And during the penalty phase, the jury learned that Michael's violent behavior didn't start with Denise. After a sledding accident at the age of 6, a brain injury changed his behavior permanently. At 13, while acting out a scene from a cartoon, he nearly killed his own brother with a bow and arrow. And at 17, after watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he grabbed a real chainsaw and chased his family members with it. No expression on his face. His IQ was tested in the borderline range, but the jury didn't see that as an excuse. And just a week later, they unanimously recommended death, with 12-0 votes. He spent the next 16 years on death row. He converted to Catholicism, attended confession, received the Eucharist regularly, and studied Scripture. A spiritual advisor visited him weekly for years. His defense team would later describe him as a model inmate and a devout Catholic, and argued that his transformation should spare him from execution. But the Florida Supreme Court disagreed. And on February 13, 2026, Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant. His execution was scheduled for March 17, 2026 at 6 p.m. at Florida State Prison near Starker. That morning, Michael woke up at 3:50 a.m. According to prison officials, he was calm and compliant throughout the day. He had one visitor and spent time with his spiritual advisor. For his final meal, Michael requested a pizza, ice cream, and a soda. At 6 p.m., the curtain to the execution chamber went up. A clergy member stood at the foot of the gurney beside him. About a minute later, Michael gave his final statement. His words were barely audible. He said, "Since finding Jesus in prison, I have tried to live as his disciple, obeying the 2 great commandments: to love God with all my heart, my mind, and all my being, and to love my neighbor, to include everyone, My family, Denise Lee's family, everyone in the gallery, and the execution team. He did not apologize, and he did not ask for forgiveness. Then the drugs began to flow. Michael started breathing heavily. His arms began to shake and his body twitched. A few minutes later, all movement stopped. The warden walked over, shook him, and yelled his name. But there was no response. A medic was called in. He was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. Michael Lee King was 54 years old. This concludes all executions carried out in March 2026. Subscribe if you want to see more cases like these, and tell us in the comments which case is still sitting in your head right now.